It wasn't long before the first echoes began. At first, they were mere whispers, snippets of voices dripping with nostalgia. Voices that clawed their way out from the buried catacombs of his mind. These were not the memories one fondly reminisces over a cup of tea. These were the dark, festering secrets of a past long sealed away. Eric remembered his childhood dog, a loyal golden retriever named Max, who had tragically died under the wheels of a speeding car, a memory he had long suppressed. The sound of Max's whimper, the sight of his twisted body, returned to him with such clarity it was as though he was back there on that rain-slicked road, a helpless boy once more. Then came the more grievous memories, parading before his mind's eye with the grim inevitability of a funeral march. His tumultuous teenage years, filled with anger and rebellion, the cold disappointment in his father's eyes that had driven him to realms far from home. The loves he had callously discarded, each face and tear revisited upon him with punishing clarity. Worse yet, the memories of his career, steeped as it was in ambition and brilliance, but also in ethical shadows. Experiments pushed too far, colleagues' warnings ignored. Faces of test subjects whose trust he had betrayed, their eyes wide with fear and pain, haunted his waking hours. Each memory was a spectre accusing him of hubris, their spectral fingers pointing at him in silent judgment. The serum had not only halted his aging but had also heightened his neural activity to extraordinary levels. His brain, now a relentless engine powered by the elixir of eternity, refused to let any memory fade away. It was as if in gaining immortality, he had also become a custodian of every moment, every decision he had ever made. As the weeks melded into months, the weight of his past grew unbearable. Dr. Hartman realized the horrific price of his immortality, an eternal life coupled with an eternal consciousness of every fault, every guilt. His once brilliant mind now felt like a prison from which death was the only escape, but an escape he could not take. Driven to the brink, Hartman began searching for a cure, a way to sever the relentless tide of memories. His lab became his refuge, the clink of vials and the hum of machines a symphony trying to drown out the cacophony in his head. He experimented feverishly, combining agents, recalculating doses, each failure more devastating than the last. One night, as thunder rolled across the sky like an ominous drum, Hartman sat hunched over his microscope, the storm outside mirroring the turmoil within. It was then that he found it, a potential antidote, a compound that could dull his brain's hyperactivity, perhaps enough to give him respite. With trembling hands, he prepared the injection, the vial glowing ominously under the flickering lights of his lab. He paused, the needle poised over his arm, his heart a battleground between hope and fear. Could this be the relief he so desperately sought, or was it another false dawn? Summoning every ounce of his courage, Dr. Hartman plunged the needle into his vein. As the compound coursed through him, his body convulsed, then stilled. The echoes in his mind screamed louder than ever, then began to fade, one by one, into silence. Dr. Hartman lay there, on the cold floor of his lab, the storm's rage easing outside. A profound peace enveloped him, the first true quiet he had felt in months. As he drifted into the dark embrace of unconsciousness, he wondered if he had finally freed himself from the chains of his memories, or if he had merely traded one prison for another. The price of immortality, he realized, was more than he had ever imagined, and now, he might pay with more than just his past. In the dim glow of his lab, surrounded by the eerie symphony of bubbling flasks and humming equipment, Dr. Eric Hartman's mind teetered on the brink of oblivion. Each moment unfolded into an eternity, each second a new wave of memories crashing against the fragile shores of his sanity. He was a prisoner trapped within his own immortal body, sentenced to an eternity of relentless recollection. The shadows of his lab seemed to mock him, stretching like the accusing fingers of those he had wronged. Faces materialized in the flickering light, pale, spectral visages that whispered of betrayal and suffering. The screams of past subjects, once muffled by time and self-justification, now echoed through the corridors with chilling clarity. Their pain, once data points in his clinical research, returned as harrowing symphonies of guilt and remorse. With each passing day, Hartman's experiments grew more desperate and radical. He mixed concoctions with trembling hands, each formula a wild guess aimed at silencing the cacophony in his head. Pills, injections, gases, tools of his trade turned weapons against his own psyche. But relief remained as elusive as sleep, and each failed experiment only deepened his despair. His appearance began to reflect his inner turmoil. His once meticulously groomed hair now hung in unkempt, greasy strands. Dark circles underlined his haunted eyes, and his hands, once steady and sure, shook with the tremors of a man teetering on the edge of madness. The mansion, too, mirrored its owner's descent. Once a pristine testament to his success and brilliance, it now lay in neglect, dust layering its surfaces like a shroud. The air was thick with the mustiness of decay, punctuated only by the chemical tang emanating from his lab. In a particularly bleak moment, driven by a particularly vivid hallucination of a young woman whose life had ended too soon under his scalpel, Hartman stumbled upon an old neurological text in his library. It suggested the use of extreme sensory deprivation to reset neurological pathways. Seizing on this with the frenzy of the damned, Hartman decided to construct an isolation tank. Working through the night with manic energy, he repurposed an old Victorian bathtub, lining it with remnants of soundproofing material and rigging it with makeshift temperature controls. He filled it with salt water, mixed to perfect buoyancy, and infused with a cocktail of sedatives and neural inhibitors. It was a crude device, but he hoped it would serve as a cocoon that would allow him to emerge free from the torture of his memories. When the tank was ready, Hartman injected himself with a strong tranquilizer and submerged his body in the lukewarm solution. The lid closed with a finality that echoed like a tombstone settling into earth. Darkness enveloped him, silence engulfed him, and for a moment, the weight of his eternal consciousness seemed to lift. But the respite was short-lived. In the void, detached from the anchor of his senses, his mind unfurled like a dark flower. Memories, unmoored from the constraints of physical reality, assaulted him with renewed vigor. His victims, real and imagined, congregated in the darkness, their faces morphing and merging in grotesque displays of his sins. Their voices, liberated from the confines of time and space, screamed accusations that filled the tank. The pressure building like water flooding a sinking ship. Hours or perhaps days passed, with time an irrelevant measure in his watery prison. Hartman's mind, subjected to an unending assault, began to fracture. Snippets of sanity surfaced briefly, gasping for air, before sinking back into the abyss of his psychosis. When he finally emerged from the tank, his body was wrinkled and pruned from the prolonged exposure to water, his mind a shattered pane of glass. He crawled from the bathroom, a broken shell of a man, incapable of distinguishing reality from the torturous constructs of his own mind. In this shattered state, he wandered the mansion, a ghost in his own home. The echoes of his experiments, the faces of those he had wronged, pursued him through the halls. No corner was dark enough to hide from his past, no room safe from the haunting. His descent into madness was complete, a tragic symphony of his own making. In seeking immortality, he had found an eternal hell, a punishment far exceeding any earthly crime. And in the depths of his tormented soul, he knew there was no escape, no cure, and no end. The immortality he had so fervently sought was now his eternal curse. His life sentence to be served in the echoing chambers of his own mad mind. Dr. Eric Hartman found himself in a relentless loop of torment, where the line between the past and present dissolved like salt in the relentless ocean. His life had become an unending sentence, punctuated by the echoes of his countless transgressions. Each day dawned not with hope but with the certain dread of what memories would assail him next. His existence was a cruel joke played by his own genius, an eternal reminiscence that afforded no respite. His once grand mansion had deteriorated into a mausoleum of his former life. Each room a monument to a memory best forgotten. The walls, stripped of their former glory, were now canvases for the mildew of neglect, the air thick with the stench of decay, an olfactory testament to his rotting soul. The mirrors, once gleaming, were speckled and tarnished, reflecting back a man he no longer recognized, a specter of his former self. Gaunt and hollow-eyed, a ghost trapped in the purgatory of his own making. With each passing moment, the weight of his eternal life pressed down on him. A constant reminder of the serum that coursed through his veins, a poison masquerading as a panacea. His scientific curiosity, once a beacon of light in the pursuit of knowledge, had mutated into a curse that tethered him to an existence devoid of peace. His mind, a battlefield strewn with the casualties of his own memories, replayed his failures with the meticulous cruelty of a tormentor perfecting their art. The faces of those he had wronged paraded before him in endless succession. There was the young assistant whose enthusiasm he had met with cold, calculated betrayal, her career ruined by his machinations. There was the old colleague who had pleaded with him to consider the moral implications of their research, only to be met with disdain and dismissal, his warnings unheeded until it was too late. And there were the subjects, oh the subjects, men and women reduced to mere data points in his quest for immortality. Their pain a footnote in his grand scientific narrative. As months melded into years, and years into decades, the seasons changing beyond the grimy windows of his estate mattered little to Hartman. Time, once a precious commodity, now stretched out before him like a desolate highway, with no destination in sight. His wanderings through the house became a ritualistic dance with his specters, each step a reminder of his hubris. In a desperate bid for solace, he turned to the written word, filling journal after journal with his confessions, his insights, his regrets. But the act of writing, meant to be cathartic, only served to deepen his despair. The ink on the page was a tangible manifestation of his thoughts, a black mirror reflecting the darkness within. The journals piled up, a library of lamentations, but they brought no relief. Occasionally, the scientist in him would surface, clawing through the madness for a solution. He experimented with new formulas, combining ancient herbal remedies with cutting-edge chemical compounds in hopes of severing the connection to his past. But each concoction failed, leaving him weaker, more fractured, his body a test site for the toxic desperation of a man trying to escape himself. His ventures outside the mansion were rare and only served to reinforce his isolation. The world had moved on, indifferent to the man who had once sought to conquer nature. People, consumed by their own lives, brushed past him, a ghost among the living. Their faces were new, but their expressions were familiar, shadows of the faces that haunted his dreams. One fateful night, driven by a particularly harrowing round of memories, Hartman wandered into the woods surrounding his estate. The moon was a thin crescent, barely lighting the path underfoot, the trees whispering secrets as he passed. The deeper into the woods he walked, the louder the whispers grew, until they were screams. Not the screams of the forest, but those of his past victims, their cries mingling with the rustling leaves. He stumbled upon a clearing, where the moonlight touched the ground like a blessing. Exhausted, he collapsed under the canopy of stars, the sky a vast, unblinking eye witnessing his torment. As he lay there, the boundary between his internal and external worlds blurred. And the earth beneath him seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The voices, the faces, the memories, they merged with the night, becoming one with the universe. In that moment, Hartman realized that there was no escaping his past, no elixir to cure his affliction. He was to be forever a prisoner of his own narrative, each memory a chain linking him to an eternity of solitude. With this epiphany, a strange peace settled over him, the peace of acceptance, bitter and hard-won. He lay there until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, bathing the world in a gentle glow. As the light touched his face, for the first time in what felt like centuries, Eric Hartman closed his eyes not to escape his memories, but to embrace them. For he understood now that to forget was never an option. To remember was his penance, his burden. And ultimately, his only companion in the eternal reminiscence of his immortal life.